Hatchet, Chapter 16. And now he stood at the end of the long part of the lake, and he was not the same. Would not be the same again. There had been many first days. First arrow day, when he first had used thread from his tattered old piece of windbreaker and some pitch from a stump to put slivers of a feather on a dry willow shaft and make an arrow that would fly correctly. Not accurately. He never really got good with it, but fly correctly so that if a rabbit or a fool bird sat in one place long enough, close enough, and he had enough arrows, he could hit it. That brought first rabbit day, when he killed one of the large rabbits with an arrow and skinned it as he had the first bird. Cooked it the same to find the meat as good, not as rich as the bird, but still good. And there were strips of fat on the back of the rabbit that cooked into the meat to make it richer. Now he went back and forth between rabbits and fool birds when he could, filling in with fish in the middle. Always hungry. I'm always hungry, but I can do it now. I can get food, and I know I can get food, and it makes me more. I know what I can do. He moved closer to the lake to a stand of nut brush. These were thick bushes with little stickler pods that held green nuts that he thought he might be able to eat, but they weren't ripe yet. He was out for a fool bird, and they liked to hide in the base of the thick part of the nut brush, back where the stems were close together and provided cover. In the second clump, he saw a bird, moved close to it, paused, and when the head feathers came up and it made a sound like a cricket, a sign of alarm just before it flew, then moved closer when the feathers went down and the bird relaxed. He did this 4 times, never looking at the bird directly, moving toward it at an angle so that it seemed as if he were moving off to the side. He had perfected this method after many attempts, and it worked so well that he had actually caught one with his bare hands, until he was standing less than 3 feet from the bird, which was frozen in a hiding altitude in the brush. The bird held for him, and he put an arrow to the bow and one of the feathered arrows, not a fish arrow, and drew and released. It was a clean miss, and he took another arrow out of the cloth pouch at his belt, which he'd made from a piece of the windbreaker sleeve, tied at one end to make a bottom. The fool bird sat still for him and did not look directly at it, until he drew again the second arrow, aimed, released, and missed again. This time the bird jerked a bit, and the arrow stuck next to it so close it almost brushed its breast. Brian only had 2 more hours, and he debated moving slowly to change the spear over to his right hand and use that to kill the bird. 1 more shot, he decided. He would try again. He slowly brought another arrow out, put it on the string, and aimed and released. And this time the fury of feathers that meant he had made a hit. The bird had been struck off center and was flopping around wildly. Brian jumped on it and grabbed it and slammed it against the ground once, sharply, to kill it. Then he stood and retrieved his arrows and made sure they were all right and went down to the lake to wash the blood off his hands. He kneeled at the water's edge and put the dead bird and his weapons down, dipped his hands into the water. It was very nearly the last act of his life. Later, he would not know why he started to turn, some smell or sound, a tiny brushing sound, but something caught his ear or nose, and he began to turn, and his head half around when he saw a brown wall of fur detach itself from the forest to his rear and come down on him like a runaway truck. He had time to just see that it was a moose. He knew them from pictures, but did not know, or could not guess, how large they were when it hit him. It was a cow, and she had horns, but she took him in the left side of the back with her forehead. She took him and threw him out into the water, and then came after him to finish the job. He had another half second to fill his lungs with air, and she was on him again, using her head to drive him down into the mud of the bottom. Insane, he thought. Just that word. Insane. Mud filled his eyes, his ears. The horn boss on the moose drove him deeper and deeper into the bottom of the muck, and suddenly it was over. He felt alone. He sputtered to the surface, sucking air and fighting his panic, and when he wiped the mud and water out of his eyes and cleared them, he saw the cow now standing sideways to him, not 10 feet away, calmly chewing on a lily pad root. She didn't appear to even see him or didn't seem to care about him, and Brian turned carefully and began swim crawl out of the water. As soon as he moved again, the hair on her back went up, and she charged him again, using her head and front hooves this time, slamming him back and down into the water on his back this time. And he screamed the air out of his lungs and hammered on her head with his fists and filled his throat with water. And she left again. Once more he came to the surface, but he was hurt now, hurt inside, hurt in his ribs, and he stayed hunched over, pretending to be dead. She was standing again, eating. Brian studied her out of one eye, looking at the bank, the other wondering how seriously he was injured, wondering if she would let him go home this time. Insane. He started to move ever so slowly. Her head turned and her back hair went up like the hair on an angry dog. And he stopped, took a slow breath, and the hair went down, and she ate more. Move, hair up, stop, hair down, move, hair up, a half a foot at a time until he was at the edge of the water. He stayed on his hands and knees, indeed was hurt, so he wasn't sure he could walk anyway, and she seemed to accept that, and she let him crawl slowly out of the water and up into the trees and the brush. When he was behind a tree, he stood carefully and took stock. Legs seemed all right, but his ribs were hurt bad. He could only take short breaths, and then he had a jabbing pain, and his right shoulder seemed to be wrenched somehow, and his bow and spear and foolbird were in the water. At least he could walk, and he had decided to leave everything when the cow moved out of the deeper water and left him. As quickly as she'd come, walking down the shoreline in the shallow waters with her long legs making sucking sounds when she pulled them free from the mud. Hanging on a pine limb, he watched her go, half expecting her to turn and come back and run him over again. But she kept going, and when she was gone from the sight, he went to the bank, found the bird, and then waited out a bit to get the bow and the spear. Neither of them was broken, and the arrows, incredibly, were still on his belt in the pouch.
I'm having trouble hearing you.